Welcome to Bits and Pieces Quilting. My name is Michelle, and today we're going to see if we can make something disappear. So stay tuned. To make my disappearing 9 patch, I'm going to use this fat quarter bundle from K Facet and this plain teal color as the block that goes in the center of each of the original blocks, just to tie in all of the different fabrics in this collection and give a little bit of a rest space for the eye across the quilt. I'm really looking forward to making this. I made a disappearing 9 patch with my mom using K Facet fabrics that she had, and it was spectacular. And so let me open up this packet. They're just gorgeous. There's 100 different colors, and yet they all coordinate beautifully. And I think with the large blocks that come into that come out of a different disappearing 9 patch, some of these colors will really just show themselves off across the quilt. So the next step is to press all of these fat quarters and to start to cut them up. A standard fat quarter is 18 by 22 inches. But don't always think that you're going to get exactly 18 by 22 inches of usable fabric in your fat quarter. And let me show you what I mean. For this disappearing 9 patch, I'm cutting my fat quarters into 4.5-inch squares for the project. And when I go to line up this fat quarter, I'm left with some choices. One choice is to line up the edges along the sides, but then across the top, that doesn't line up. Another option is to line up the top and the bottom like this, but then you can see it overhangs here and it will overhang on this side as well. But how do I know that I'm getting a straight of grain? How do I know that the fibers in the fabric are lined up properly? The way that I test this is by holding up the fat quarter. And let me see if I can show you this on camera. And I'm holding it, can you see at the bottom how it hangs nicely? If I line up the edges, so if I move it like this so that the edges of the fat quarter are even, you can see at the bottom it doesn't line up, it doesn't hang properly. There's no way that those fibers are straight. And so this is how I figure out how to lay out my fat quarter. If I pull up the bottom and the top so that they're perfectly even, it's subtle, but you can see that that doesn't work either. What works is when the edges aren't perfectly lined up at the top or at the side, but this is a nice, even fold in the fabric without pulling on the fibers in any way. So this is how I'm going to cut this fat quarter. And for this project, I'm cutting 4.5-inch squares. So I'm going to start the way I usually cut fabric is by cutting a little more than I need off of the first edge, making sure there's enough to get the cut I want. So I'm going to set this at almost 5 inches because I have a little bit of this overhang I have to account for. And I'm going to cut a 4.5-inch strip. I decided on 4.5-inch pieces for this project instead of 5-inch pieces because I wanted smaller pieces throughout the entire quilt. I think that's going to make it even more playful and even more bright. After the 4.5-inch cut, after the 5-inch cut, I flip it over and then line it up to get that perfect squared edge on this side. And this little piece, unfortunately, is waste. I'm going to cut 2 more 4.5-inch strips out of these pieces. And then I'm going to save the last piece. Now, in a perfect world, 4.5 and 4.5 is 9, and another 4.5 and 4.5 is another 18 inches. I should be able to get 4 4.5-inch strips across this 18-inch piece of fabric. But as you can see, that's not going to work. This last piece is just 4 inches because things just don't line up perfectly. So I'm going to save this piece And I'm going to cut the extras from all of my fat quarters into partial pieces, and they won't be, I'll make the same shape as my disappearing 9-patch blocks, but I won't make them with the same construction method. Once my strips are cut, I'm going to line these 3 4.5-inch strips up, and I'm going to cut my 4.5-inch pieces this way. And I'm going to do that with all the fat quarters in my bundle until I'm finished cutting them all up. With that, I'll be able to make some beautifully scrappy disappearing 9-patch blocks. So those 3 are lined up nice and tight. I'm going to cut that at a little bit larger than 4.5 inches and then square it up to the size that I need, like so. And I should be able to get 4 of these across with another piece left over. And I'm going to save all of my leftovers, like I said, and cut those into the units that I need to make some additional blocks for this project. So there we go. There's 12 4.5-inch squares. I have this piece left over that's about 4.5 inches, 4 inches wide, and then this piece times 3, which we'll cut up in a few minutes. These are all the fabrics for my disappearing 9-patch. It was my entire fat quarter bundle of K-Facet fabrics. These are the fabrics from the bundle. I've added this fabric as a as a solid, almost solid, that ties in with all of these fabrics, and it's going to be my consistent color all through the disappearing 9-patch. So I've cut 4.5-inch squares out of this as well, and let me show you how to build a disappearing 9-patch block. So it's exactly as it sounds. It's a 9-patch. I realized that these fabrics pretty much matched my undermat, so I brought my lighter mat up here so that you can see it a little better. To build a disappearing 9-patch, I want to put one of these teal colored blocks in the center. And then I want to build a 9-patch block around it from all of the different pieces that I've cut. And I want it nice and scrappy. So I'm just going to pull different blocks. I'm not really going to worry too much about the way that things are laid out. I will try and get a slight mix of color. If the colors are too similar side by side, I might swap them out a little bit. But ultimately, you just want to use all of the fabrics across your collection that you've decided for the project and lay them in like this. And there we go. It's a simple 9-patch. It's called a 9-patch because there's 9 fabrics. And I'm going to do this with all the pieces that I've cut and with this teal color in the center of every single one. So I'm going to sew this together, and then I will show you the next step to make the disappearing 9-patch. This is what the 9-patch block looks like when it's all sewn together. This is exactly as I had laid it out. To press the block, I pressed the seams in each row in the same direction, in alternating directions for each row, and then I just pressed everything forward. There's no complex pressing for this project because all of my fabrics are all about the same tone. There's no real lights or darks. So you don't really have to worry about fabrics perhaps showing through on the seam allowance. So I've just pressed each row like this so that the seams all nest together. So with the finished 9-patch, now we have to get to the disappearing part. So our blocks are 4.5 if you recall, and with a 1/2-inch seam allowance on each side, your blocks should finish at 4 inches because you take that 1/4-inch seam allowance off of each side and are left with a 4-inch finished piece. These edge blocks should be 4 1/4 because we still have the seam allowance here on the other side, and that's exactly what they are. So to cut the disappearing 9-patch, you want to cut it in half in both directions. I've brought out my longer ruler because my 12-inch rulers are just not quite long enough. So I've brought out the longer one. So if I want to cut this in half, I want to line up my ruler at the 2-inch mark along the seam right here. So this is 2 inches from this seam to the middle of my block. And I'm just going to make sure that my ruler is square. It's along this line nicely, and it's along one of my seam lines quite nicely as well. So I'm going to cut it across here. And then I want to do the same thing in the other direction. Let me see if I can do this without turning it. I don't want to shift my blocks at all. I want to line up the 2-inch mark in the same, on that same plane along this seam line. Like, oops, don't let it shift. There we go. And give that a slice. And as simple as that, our disappearing 9 patch is now 4 separate blocks, a 4.5-inch square with 2 little sashing pieces and a cornerstone. And what we're going to do to make for the next step is we're going to take this one, and we're just going to swap places and then sew those back together again. But before I sew these back together, let's just take a look at one of these blocks. Let me just slide these out of the way. And if we look at this block, it's a 4.5-inch square with a narrow sashing strip and a small cornerstone. These pieces should be 2.25 inches because they're half of a 4.5-inch block. And this should be 2.25 inches square. And so because this is bits and pieces quilting, I wanted to look at my bits and pieces at the leftovers and see if I could cut these pieces separately to construct the disappearing 9 patch by using up my bits and pieces. So these are the pieces that are not quite 4.5 inches, and just outside the camera here, these are the leftover pieces when I cut my 4.5-inch strips. So let me start with these ones. We know these are 4.5 inches already. So I just need to trim these down to 2.25 inches, and they will be useful as these sashing pieces on my disappearing 9 patch. So I'm just going to line up some of those and give them a slice at 2.25 inches. 2.25 is a very strange size for me. I usually work in 2 inches or 2.5 inches, but not hard to cut. So those are 2.25. So now those are going to be ready for my project. I also cut a 2.25 inch strip of my accent fabric and cross-cut that into 2.25 inch squares. So now, actually, let me just do a couple more of these at 2.25. Oops. Check twice before you cut. There we go, 2.25. So now what I could do is I could take a square. Let's see, what should we take? Let's take something like this one. Take a square, add a sashing strip, add a sashing strip, and add a cornerstone. Sew these together, and I'll get the same piece that I got from my disappearing 9 patch. So it's a different construction technique, and then of course I would make 4 of these and sew them together the same way that I'm sewing these blocks. It's a different construction technique, but it really will make use of the bits and pieces. So I'm going to sew this together, and then I'm going to sew this together, and I'll come back and show you where we're at. And this is the finished block for the disappearing 9 patch. It's just that simple. These blocks will then just get sewn together, one beside each other, all the way across the quilt. These little squares will repeat themselves in these corners as the other blocks are added. And if you can imagine in your mind, if you swap these 2 blocks back, then our 9 patch will be back to the way it was when we started this project at the beginning of the video. It's mixed them up a little bit. The fact that these and these are quite close together I think the quilt is going to be wild enough that you will never notice. And with our bits and pieces approach, these are those pieces that I showed you where I just sewed the sashing and the cornerstone pieces to the block. This you can see is one of these units, or here, or here, or here. So I'll make a bunch of these with the bits and pieces that are left over. I'll make a bunch of these with the 4.5-inch squares, and then we will assemble the quilt top. Now I showed you how I cut the 2.25 by 4.5-inch pieces out of these leftovers, but I also have some of these strips that are leftovers, these strips here. These are not wide enough to get a 4.5-inch piece to make squares. This one, for example, at the widest edge here, it's about 4.25. At this part where it comes narrower, it's less than 4. I just do the same thing. I cut this at 2.25 because that is the width I need for the sashing pieces. And then that leaves me with one more piece. This is, I can get a 1.5-inch strip out of this. And I save 1.5-inch strips. That's one of the pieces that's the smallest piece I keep in my scrap bin. So I will have a stack of 1.5-inch pieces of K-facet fabric that I will find to use for another project. But I'll make use of all of these other bits and pieces. These 2.25-inch strips get cut into 4.5-inch pieces, like this. And so I should be able to get 4 more of these pieces as well. So I'll have a lot of sewing to do, but I love sewing, so I don't mind having a little bit of extra sewing to do in order to use up all these bits and pieces and to get more blocks for my quilt. This last little piece, I'm going to cut it into a 2-inch square. I don't save 2.25-inch pieces, and it's not big enough to make a 2.5-inch piece, so I will cut that into a 2-inch square. So with a 1.5-inch strip, a 2-inch square as my leftovers, and I'll make use of all the other pieces for the quilt. Got a lot of sewing to do, so I'm going to go get to it. I wanted to show you one more time how to make the scrappy version of the Disappearing 9 patch. So this is the block we made earlier with the 2 sashing strips and the cornerstone. And what I've laid out here is the same Disappearing 9 patch that I laid out earlier, except my pieces in the middle here are already cut. That's because I'm using the scrappy pieces. But I thought this might help you visualize how to use the scrappy pieces in the Disappearing 9 patch and get the same result. Imagine these were complete squares and they've just already been cut, and the same in the middle. Imagine that that was the 4.5-inch piece, but now it's already been cut. It's been pre-cut. So I would still sew these together as separate units. And then the same way that we swapped these blocks in the Disappearing 9 patch, come back and do exactly the same thing. That way you have complete consistency across all of your blocks. I will eventually use up every little piece. So some of my blocks towards the end, I may run out of matching pieces for the sashing, but that's fine with me. That's your decision to make as well in terms of how scrappy you really want your project. But I think given the chaos of this fat quarter pack, I think having those mixed up, I don't think you'll ever even notice because there's so many colors going on in this. So I'm going to get to sewing all of my different Disappearing 9 patch blocks. Whenever I'm working on a project or developing a new pattern, I always look for ways to make the very most of all the bits and pieces. So for this Disappearing 9 patch, I started with 20 fat quarters. And earlier in the video, I showed you some of the challenges with using fat quarters when their measurements aren't exactly as you expect them to be. So I have 34 finished Disappearing 9 patches here. And I have enough squares. I was counting them as I went just because I was conscious that I might not have enough. I have enough squares to make 4 more exactly the same, so that will be 38. And then I have a few additional pieces. There's a few pieces here and some of these smaller scrappy pieces. So what I'm going to try to do is see if I can use enough of my bits and pieces, and that's these pieces, the pieces that are left over. These are 1.5-inch strips and the 2-inch squares. I'm going to see if I can use these 1.5-inch strips just to stretch it out to get that extra block and a half that I need for a full 40 blocks. Because then that way I think with some borders, some of this teal fabric as a border, I think I might even be able to get 2 quilts out of this fat quarter bundle. The final version of the pattern, when I write it up, will have very clear numbers for the sizes that you'll get. And I will put all of that information into the pattern of the project sheet once I'm finished. But in this creative and experimental phase, I really do want to use up all these bits and pieces. So what I think I'm going to do is take these 1.5-inch strips and I'll probably sew them together. And then I will trim them down so that I get these little pieces made out of patchwork. I'm hoping that the patterns are so busy that you would never notice a tiny little seam down the center of a piece like this. And I think I only need a few of them to be able to stretch the fabric I have left into those 6 additional blocks to give me an even 40. Wish me luck. I'm going to dive in and give it a try. I've sewn together 4 of the leftover strips. There's 3 here, and then this was my test to trim down to the right size, and I think this is going to work. So I took a 1.5-inch strip and I cut it in half and I sewed the pieces together, and then I've pressed these seams open. I want this to be able to lay really flat, and I want the seam to be as unobtrusive as possible, and I think the flatter I can make it, the less obvious the seam will be. And so the next step is to cut these to size. So I need them to be 4.5 inches long and 2.25 inches wide, because you'll remember my squares for this project are 4.5, and half of 4.5 is 2.25. So I'm just cutting these to the right length at 4.5 inches. And then what I'm going to do, because a 1.5-inch piece sewn to a 1.5-inch piece with a 1/4-inch seam allowance gives you a 2.5-inch piece. So instead of cutting a single 1/4 inch off of one side, I'm actually going to center the seam down the center of these pieces. So it's silly maybe, but I think I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to cut 1/8 of an inch off of each side. And that way I know that the seam is down the center. And again, I'm hoping that that makes it just a little less obvious and a little less obtrusive in the final product. So that's one piece, and I'll just trim this down. Maybe a little bit fiddly, but ultimately it uses up those bits and pieces. And if I can get 2 complete quilts out of my fabric bundle, I think that that's a really good use of my time. So there we go. So that's the piece. Now, ultimately, to make one of these disappearing 9 patches with the leftover bits and pieces, we put this together like this. And I have the other set that I did here. I put those on this side. And then I'm going to mix it, I think, with some of the other complete pieces so that this block isn't made up just of leftovers, that there are still, well, leftovers of leftovers, I suppose. And then I need 4 other blocks. So let's put these into here, something a little different, and one more. There we go. So that will give me my disappearing 9 patch once I sew all those pieces together. I'm pleased with that. If you're really looking for it, I think it's noticeable. But in the grand scheme of the entire quilt, if there's about 4 or 5 of these pieces scattered about the whole thing, I think that's going to work just fine. And if I can get 2 complete quilts, that'll be brilliant. This is a completed block for the Disappearing 9 patch with 2 pieces that had to be pieced. So there's this section here and this section here. And I think it's hardly noticeable. In the grand scheme of the entire quilt, I'm going to need to do 3 blocks like this, 3 blocks that are made up of these little bits and pieces. 3 blocks over 2 complete quilts. I think that's acceptable. I don't think that that's going to be very noticeable, especially in the chaos of the entire project. I'm really pleased with that. You can see my seams are laying nice and flat because I pressed them open, and that block is ready to go into one of the quilts. I have 2 more to make, and then 3 regular blocks to have a complete set of 40 blocks. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on the Disappearing 9 patch, and I hope that you'll give it a try. In the end, out of the 20 fat quarters, I was able to use up all the bits and pieces except these. A few 2-inch squares and a few 2.5-inch strips. By being able to stretch those last little pieces to get the 40 blocks I needed, I was able to make 2 complete quilts. The final quilts are 57 by 69 inches wide, including the borders, and I've got Jason standing up here in the backyard holding up the quilt so I can show you the quilt top. I'm really glad I stretched out that fabric, as you can see in the top corner here of one of the quilts, just to get those extra blocks in order to get 2 complete quilts. I think they look great. It's a riot of color. They're so cheerful. They're a great size for curling up in front of the TV, or they'd make a great gift for a kid. Don't forget to visit my website at www.bitsandpiecesquilting.com. There'll be a pattern there with final sizes and dimensions for this project. Please like and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for watching, and don't forget to make the most of your fabric bits and pieces.